Good morning. My name is Andrew Elefant. I'm Kittyhawk's Director of Legal and Policy, and welcome to our webinar about adopting safety management system practices for your enterprise UAS program. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Kittyhawk. Kittyhawk helps companies run drone programs with software solution. You can learn a lot more about Kittyhawk at our website, www.kittyhawk.io. As you can see, a lot of our customers are in industrial and public safety organizations where safety is a top priority. A little bit about myself. My name is Andrew Elefant. I'm a lawyer with a tech policy background, and I'm also a private pilot with instrument and multi-engine ratings. I've been a remote pilot since 2016. So before we launch into the rest of the presentation, I want to go over some expectations about the webinar. So one of the unique parts about the UAS world is that you have a mix of old school aviation folks, technology folks who aren't aviators, and people that aren't aviators at all but understand the value of drones for their company or the work that they do. And getting everyone on the same page is challenging. This webinar is going to attempt to get everyone on the same page with safety management systems and other important safety practices for an enterprise UAS operation. And for the most part, that means thinking more holistically about safety, understanding the basics of a safety management system, and going into a little bit more detail about how you can adopt SMS principles for your enterprise UAS operation. So first, a little bit about what is a safety management system. So a safety management system is a decision-making framework at its core. So it's a framework to think about safety and make decisions in a more organized, methodical, and transparent manner. When thinking about your safety management system, think about it like a business plan for safety. So it operates in a very similar way. Organizations of all sizes can apply elements and components of SMS to increase their operational and organizational safety. And it's also, as with a business plan, it's very particularized to your operations and very bespoke to the operations that your organization does. As you can see, the four main components of a safety management system are safety policy, safety promotion, safety risk management, and safety assurance. And all of those work together as components of a safety management system. So we're going to go into more detail on each one of these components and discuss how they work together. Safety policy is the most important of the SMS components. So I started off with a definition of what a policy is. A policy is a deliberate system of principles to guide decisions and achieve rational outcomes. It's a statement of intent implemented as a procedure. So I know there's a lot of words there, so let's unpack that for a second. I've put in bold some of the words that I think are important for you to take away from this definition. So a safety policy should be deliberate, and it should, at its core, be a decision guide document. So the best way to think about a safety policy is a safety policy should align the organization's values with procedures to accomplish those values. So to say that another way, it's important in a safety policy to state your goals and describe the actions that are needed to accomplish those goals. And it's important to note that a safety policy is not a one-size-fits-all document. It really should be unique to the organization because every organization is unique in terms of size, the type of operations that they perform, and using someone else's safety policy is only going to help you so far. The second important part of safety policy is to design performance objectives. So, this is why developing a safety policy is a good idea for an organization of any size, because it forces you to think a little bit deeper about what are the goals in terms of safety of your organization. What is your risk tolerance? What is important to monitor, track, and be analyzed in the name of improving your safety outcomes? And all of these goals and risk tolerances can be different from organization to organization. For example, you could be prioritizing having zero accidents or zero incidents while operational for a period of time. Or it could be that your goal is 100% compliant flights from everyone in the operation. These are complementary goals, but they're not exactly the same thing. And so part of developing a safety policy is going into more detail about what you value in terms of safety and what sort of procedures will help you get from A to B. Lastly, an important component of a safety policy is accountability. So, accountability is going over who is responsible ultimately for executing, updating, and monitoring some compliance with the safety policy. So, everyone in the organization is going to have a part in successfully completing safe operations and in implementing any sort of safety program. But it should be the responsibility of one specific person, where possible, and in an organization large enough, to be in charge of safety policy and safety in general, so that everyone is very clear on who is accountable for different aspects of following the safety policy. And one other note on developing a safety policy is that you don't want to overcomplicate your safety policy. It really should be designed for your specific organization. So, what does this mean in practice? If you were thinking about developing a safety policy for your organization, where would you start this process? The three things that are most important to keep in mind about developing a safety policy are: be specific and execution oriented. So, this is the part of designing a policy where it's not enough just to state the goals that you're trying to achieve, but it's important to be execution oriented and describe exactly how you will accomplish these goals and what sort of processes and activities will help you reach that point of safe and compliant operations. The second part of a safety policy that you should keep in mind while developing a safety policy is that it should be simple to follow. It should be easy to follow, clear, and easy for everyone to understand. An important part of this being simple to follow is to limit any possibility of confusion about processes, roles, responsibilities, or what to do in any specific set of circumstances. So, someone should be able to read the safety policy and innately understand what they're supposed to do in a given situation. And as I said before, an overcomplicated safety policy could lead to taking shortcuts or ignoring the policy. And in that case, it's almost counterproductive to develop a safety policy in the first place. Because if it's too complicated, people aren't going to take it seriously and they're just going to ignore the policy. Lastly, a couple of tips on developing a safety policy. So, as with any policy that you develop, it should be reviewed periodically and updated accordingly. An SMS and a safety policy is not a stagnant document. Second, everyone is a stakeholder, but someone needs to be responsible for the overall success of the safety policy and a safety management system in general. The buck needs to stop with someone. Lastly, don't forget to include emergency response as a part of your safety policy. It's really important to know what is expected of your employees and other stakeholders in an emergency so that people know what to do in advance. The second element is safety risk management. And as with any other form of risk management, it deals with the forecasting, identification, and evaluation of risks, together with designing procedures to avoid or minimize the impact of these risks. So what does that mean? The key words here are forecast, identify, and evaluate. Safety risk management is a process by which you look into the future, think about what sort of risks are going to be inherent with your operations, and think about designing procedures to avoid or minimize these risks. If they're going to exist, you need to have a plan to address these risks. So a couple of things about safety risk management. Safety risk management is a continuous process. As with any other aspect of safety, the processes involved with safety risk management necessarily means that the process is continuous. You will never reach a point at which you will have perfect safety, because when you're operating in that environment, there's no such thing as a no risk type of situation. However, you always need to be contemplating what could happen and what could come next. And so that's why safety risk management and safety in general is a continuous process. The processes of a formal safety risk management are a little bit onerous for some organizations, but it's important to know what a formal SMS would require in terms of safety risk management so that you can take the most applicable portions of it and apply it to your business. So those are things like having a description of the systems of your business and analyze how they work together. You should identify hazards that exist in a current state and predicted future states. And you should be able to analyze those safety risks as they come up in a proactive fashion. And lastly, you need to be able to assess this risk, know when it's within your acceptable risk limits. And lastly, whenever possible, what can you put into place to minimize your risk programmatically so that it's not even a decision that needs to be taken? It's just something that comes automatically and programmatically from the operations that you're already doing. So what does this mean in practice? If you were thinking of developing some safety risk management principles for your enterprise drone program, this is what you should be thinking about. It's important to understand the inputs and the risks of your operation. So the most important part of this is that you need to be able to quantify your risks whenever possible and be clear about what your level of acceptable risk is. The reason you should quantify your risk is that if you quantify something, you're much more able to fully address the issue instead of coming up with a solution that may not actually solve your problem. And so when you can measure and quantify things, you're able to design a solution that fits and completely addresses that risk. So you need to understand your inputs and your risks. And part of this is in terms of quantifying and gathering data and understanding your inputs is that safety risk management particularly is a data-driven decision-making process. And the reason why data-driven decision-making is something that you should be striving for is it minimizes emotional or gut decisions and makes it so that if you are able to eliminate some of the emotion from these decisions, you'll at the very least be able to more comprehensively and coherently explain why it is you're taking the steps that you're taking. And one of the best places, or one of the first places you should be looking about how to look at your risk limitations, are look at the regulations. The regulations will tell you a lot about what you need to be measuring and what you ultimately can be held accountable for. And lastly, make it easy to identify operational hazards. So, for example, make sure that you are able to identify relevant airspace and operating rules to ensure that you're compliant on all of your flights. For example, use your checklist for multiple purposes. When you're testing and doing a pre-flight on the aircraft, test the propellers. Make sure that the propellers don't have a hidden crack in them, and make sure that things that are hidden are also checked out, so that you're confident that when you're operating, you're doing so in a way that you've eliminated a lot of risks. And where possible, you should design some of your systems or programs to make it impossible to proceed while there's a lingering potential for risk. So the third component is safety assurance, and this is a promise or a pledge or a declaration intended to give confidence and demonstrate that processes are properly applied and continue to achieve their intended objectives. So safety assurance is the way that you measure and monitor that the rest of the SMS components are working as they should. Safety assurance means that you should be confident and have the ability to be confident in your drone program and in the safety policies and procedures that you have in place, and that it's working as designed. And so the elements of a formal safety assurance are performance monitoring and measurement, and performance assessing. And again, this is another way that it's important to measure and quantify your safety risk and your elements of safety whenever possible. And because also it's more difficult to assess and give assurance that what you're doing is working properly if you're not able to quantify this data. So, what metrics will show that your SMS is improving safety or not improving safety? And the other part of safety assurance that's very important is, can you prove that you're following your SMS? Are you tracking important regulatory and operational data? And also, is your data being stored and processed securely, and can you access that data easily? Safety assurance is one of the components that will most help you in your compliance journey because documentation and record keeping are such an integral part of this component. And as you can see, a good safety assurance process will provide a roadmap for improving itself and respond to both anticipated and unanticipated challenges. For example, one of the more important parts is real-time compliance monitoring. So a good safety assurance process should allow you to know in real time how your SMS is performing. And this is really important, especially in larger organizations where not everyone has the same visibility into the day-to-day operations or even the mission-to-mission operations. And so a good safety assurance process will allow that visibility and transparency across the organization. And last but not least, it's important to also make sure that this data is protected, and also to make sure that your processes for safety assurance are helpful moving forward. And these can be done with things like audits, performance reviews, or retros to help drive this process. Next is safety promotion, and safety promotion is what ties it all together. Safety promotion is about communication, training, education, and ultimately building a good safety culture. So, in terms of safety promotion at the organizational level, safety promotion is where you have the opportunity to really develop your safety culture. And part of that means deciding how important safety is to you. Of course, everyone's going to say that safety is important to them, but quantifying what sort of risk tolerance you have and how important safety and what level of safety is to your organization is an important thing to understand and to discuss and communicate about. Um, the other part of safety promotion is communication and trust are essential to a properly functioning safety management system. People need to understand and trust that they will be allowed to, for instance, make reports on important safety information without fear of retribution, and that they can be frank and upfront about safety issues so that they don't have to fear talking about safety. So, lastly, if you're a smaller organization, what should you be prioritizing if you're building a safety management system? So you should be prioritizing adaptable components and things that can be improved in more of a modular fashion as you grow as an organization. Again, make it easy to follow. The reality is that small organizations have people wearing a lot of different hats and they can't devote all of their time to any one task. So striking the right balance of making an SMS easy to follow while incorporating formal and informal processes is something that smaller organizations will get a lot out of. And lastly, this is especially important in smaller organizations, but it's applicable to programs of all sizes. People can suffer from information overload and safety overload. So procedures should be prioritizing surfacing the right information at the right time because it'll make it easier for all of the relevant stakeholders to do their job better and safer. And lastly, what should a larger organization prioritize? Some of the things that are particularly important to larger organizations is staying organized. So there's a lot more to manage in a larger organization, not just operationally, aircraft, operators, documents, but there is a larger organization at play of which a UAS program is probably only one part of the business. So it's important to stay organized and keep organization as a key prospect and component of your safety system. The other part for a larger organization, if you're in a heavily regulated industry, consider integrating SMS components into things that you already do for compliance processes. So what checklists, what safety program are you already running that you can add some specifically aviation and UAS components into an already existing compliance process? And lastly, organizations of a larger size may need to standardize their information and send it across a larger organization. And so it's important when you're designing a safety program or any sort of safety program, it's important to understand where this information may end up and how it may ultimately be used. And that can help you gather the right information and put it in the right format. So to sum up, safety is very dynamic. An outdated SMS will lose value, and the best ones are adaptable to changes and new inputs. Your safety is unique to your organization, and the best safety processes are ones that are tailored to your organization, the operations that you do, and the personnel that you have. And part of this comes from the safety culture that you implement as an organization. And lastly, safety, when quantified and specific, is going to be most helpful in terms of developing a safety program and processes for your enterprise drone program. So with that, here are some more resources to learn about safety, including FAA resources, and stay tuned for our next episode, which will be on basic beyond visual line of sight operations.
So the first question that was asked is that I can address is generally who or what drives the SMS. So generally, the person who drives the SMS is someone who's in a position of authority in the organization. Probably the best person to drive an SMS, especially for an enterprise UAS program, is going to be someone who's the most familiar with the overall flight operations. So this is someone like a chief pilot or someone who understands the UAS operations, but is also in a position to interface with other people in the organization and is in a role where they're listened to and have a little bit of authority to drive this. Because having one person drive the SMS is definitely going to be a good way to have people be more accountable to the SMS and its components. So another question that we received is, what is your opinion on safety risk management tools that are most adaptable from manned to unmanned aviation? What you're seeing as the right balance between without overburdening? So in terms of SRM tools that are most adaptable from manned aviation to unmanned, I think that the one important overall thing to keep in mind is is that the right SRM tool is going to be one that keeps things simple. I know that there are a lot of SRM tools out there, especially in the traditional aviation world, um, and I think the one of the good benchmarks to start off with is, as you said, without overburdening, look for something that's simple that covers your needs, and don't try to boil the ocean in the first go. And so look for a tool that provides the information that you need without providing too much. And one way to do that may be to start slowly and find something that just tracks a few things well, and then kind of go on from there and build and add more complexity into it as as you progress. So another question is, do you have areas where you would point out performance indicators regarding drone management and UTM that might be different from traditional aviation? I think one way that a UAS program would differ from traditional aviation. I think one of these just scale and complexity and volume of flights. I think that's part of the reason why UAS have been adopted so readily, and is because it's a lot easier to scale up into large numbers. And so I think that one way that drone management differs from traditional aviation is you have a larger number of aircraft. Some of them are very, very complex, and some of them are a lot less complex. And so because you have different type of aircraft and you perform different missions, I think those are some of the ways that regarding drone management that may be different from traditional aviation. Please feel free to ask more questions. I'm happy to continue answering some of your questions. Let me see if there's any that haven't been addressed. Oh, so that's a good question. So someone asked, we've drafted a drone operations policy. Should we also have an SMS policy from the overall drones policy? The short answer for that, without knowing exactly what is in your drone operations policy, um, I think there's some value in having an SMS policy or just a safety policy separate from your more operational policy. But I would say that, in this situation, if you already have a drone operations policy, really focus on where you can supplement and support the policies that you already have in place. So if you already have a drone operations policy, I would probably start with a simple safety policy that may address some of the gaps or more of the conceptual parts of safety that your drone operations policy may not address in as much detail. So another question was, other than metrics such as compliance with risk assessments, checklists, and crashes, are there metrics you would recommend? We currently use Kittyhawk. I think one of the metrics that I particularly recommend, especially given my background in kind of on the regulatory compliance side of things, metrics that I recommend are ones where you can verify that the flights that you're doing are 100% compliant, and that's primarily, as I addressed in the presentation, that's primarily on the airspace and operations side of things, and being able to not only to know whether a checklist has been run, but I think it's metrics that show your completion percentage, or metrics that can show how much of your checklist you're running, and how compliant your overall operation is. I think is going to be a helpful metric. Any more questions? And if you don't want to, if you don't have a question now, and one comes up later, feel free to email me directly. I'd be happy to go over these questions and kind of more specific questions in more detail on an individual level. Oh, I see we have one more question. How often should I'm not sure the how often should safety management be audited? I think a good answer to this is both to have a schedule by which you're dedicating yourself to auditing and updating yourself, whether that's every 6 months, every year, etc. It's good to capture a cadence for that, but also you need to be flexible and realize that there are certain triggering events that may precipitate an audit being necessary, at least an audit being necessary, at least kind of internally. We have one more question. One question was just plans for future SMS tools being integrated. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's something that we're working on and contemplating, especially just ways that we can have our customers operate more safely. So we're always considering ways to integrate safety tools into the platform. Another question was, are you opening yourself to more liability by having too detailed SMS procedures? Are more general better? Without, and this is not legal advice, but I don't think you're opening yourself up to more liability by having too detailed of an SMS procedure. But that is a very good question, and I think goes to the point of you don't want to go into too much detail, because there is a good balance between being detailed and specific enough to make it valuable while also not boxing yourself into a corner. So I would say if you do have to decide kind of too detailed or not quite detailed enough, I think it's at the very least it's good to begin with something that's a little bit too vague and slowly add detail. But I certainly understand the balance between being comprehensive and inclusive without being too detailed and too complex, and potentially triggering some sort of liability. So hopefully that answers your question. I know that that's an important balance to make in all of this. Well, let's see if there's another couple of questions before we call it. Okay, well, since I don't see any additional questions, I think we can go ahead and call it here, especially since I want to be mindful of everyone's time. But before we end, just wanted to say, thank you for joining us. I hope that this was informative and thought-provoking. And as I said, feel free to email me. I'm Andrew at kittyhawk.io. Yeah, feel free to email me and follow up with any questions. And as stated, I think at the start of this presentation, we'll be emailing this presentation to attendees who signed up via email. So I hope you all have a good rest of the day, and thanks for tuning in.